The land agent in Redemption had called it the Blackwood Place, and the name was the only solid thing about it. Everything else was rumor and distance. Maud paid her last $80, the worn bills counted twice by the agent's plump, dismissive fingers, for a deed to a place he swore was 60 miles from his own comfortable desk, and therefore 60 miles from anywhere else that mattered. The men loafing by the general store's potbelly stove had fallen silent when she'd walked in, her worn traveling coat and the set of her jaw marking her as a woman with no one to speak for her. They had not started talking again until she was outside, the deed a thin, useless-feeling paper in her hand. Then a low laugh had followed her, cut off as the door swung shut. She bought flour, salt, beans, and a small sack of oats with the change, the clerk's eyes lingering on her patched valise as if he could see right through to the emptiness inside. She did not ask for credit. She did not ask for kindness. She had learned long ago that the world gave what it gave, and asking only announced what you lacked. The journey took 4 days. The hired wagon left her at the turnoff, the driver looking at the faint track vanishing into the high, lonely chaparral as if it led to the edge of the world. He tipped his hat, but his eyes were full of a pity she couldn't afford to accept. "Nearest ranch is the Double R, ma'am," he'd offered, unasked. 60 miles south of here. Nothing at all north. Nothing but this. He gestured with his whip at the vast, silent expanse of sage and stone. Then he'd turned his team and rumbled away, leaving her in a quiet so complete it felt like a pressure against her ears. The cabin, when she finally reached it, was better than the laugher in the store had promised, and worse than she had hoped. It was small, solid, made of thick pine logs weathered to the color of a wasp's nest. The roof sagged, but it held. The stone chimney was dark with the soot of 1,000 forgotten fires. Weeds grew thick against the door, but the door itself was heavy, with an iron latch that felt good in her hand. Inside, it smelled of dust, mice, and time. But it was hers. No landlord to placate, no mistress to serve. The thought was so new, so enormous, it left no room for fear. She spent the first week in a fever of work. She swept out the layers of dust and leaves, her broom a weapon against the neglect. She patched the chinking with mud and grass, her hands raw and chapped. She cleared the weeds and found a small, stone-lined well with a bucket on a frayed rope. The water was cold and sweet. A miracle. She was alone, but she was not destitute. She had a roof, water, and a sack of beans. It was more than she'd had a month before. The vast, unending silence was her only neighbor. Then came the first morning. She rose before the sun, a habit ingrained by years of service, and went to the well. The air was sharp with the coming of fall, the ground stiff with a light frost that silvered every surface. And there, in the delicate white tracery, was a perfect circle of hoofprints. They were clear, deep, and impossibly fresh. They followed the perimeter of the cabin, a dozen feet out, a neat, deliberate ring etched into the frost. Maud stopped, the bucket halfway to the well coping. She looked toward the endless plains. 60 miles. The wagon driver's voice was clear in her memory. 60 miles south. Nothing north. A wild horse then. A Mustang, driven down from the high mesas by thirst. But the prints were shod. A faint, clean rim of iron was visible in the clearest of them. A shod horse was a ridden horse. A ridden horse had a rider. She scanned the horizon, every fold of the land, every cluster of rock and juniper. Nothing. Not a flicker of movement. Not a plume of dust. The sun was clearing the eastern hills now, a blinding sheet of gold, and the frost was already turning to dark, damp patches on the ground. By the time she had pulled up her first bucket of water, the prints were melting into the soil, becoming just another set of marks on the earth. She must have been mistaken. Old prints, revealed by the frost. That had to be it. She shook her head, annoyed at her own foolishness, and carried the water inside. The second morning, she knew she had not been a fool. The prints were there again. This time there was no frost, only the damp, dark earth of early morning. A new set of tracks, laid precisely over the faint scuffs of the day before. The same circle, the same shod prints. Deep, as if from a heavy animal walking with a slow, steady gait. She knelt, touching the rim of one print with her finger. The soil was cool, compressed, still holding the shape perfectly. They were hours old, at most. A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air went through her. This was not a lost horse. Lost horses do not circle a cabin night after night. This was a watch. She stood slowly, her gaze sweeping the landscape again, but this time with a prickle of unease. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt attentive. She spent the day with a new awareness, her ears straining for the sound of a hoof on stone, her eyes constantly drawn to the window. She saw nothing but the wind moving through the dry grass and the slow crawl of shadows. That night, she barred the heavy door and sat with her father's old fowling piece across her lap, though she had no shot for it. She was not sure if she was trying to keep something out, or if she was afraid of what was already there, just beyond her walls, watching her. On the third morning, she was ready. She woke in the deep dark before dawn, not even lighting a lamp. She moved a stool to the single window, the one that looked out over the widest stretch of land, and she sat. She did not move. She barely breathed. The moon was a sliver, offering no light, and the world outside her window was a formless, featureless black. She watched the blackness until it began to soften at the edges, turning from ink to charcoal, then to gray. The stars faded. The horizon began to define itself against the sky. She watched, her eyes burning with the effort, until the full, pale light of dawn filled the landscape. There was nothing. She had seen nothing. Not a shadow. Not a flicker. With a sigh of frustration, she finally pushed herself up from the stool, her joints aching. She unbarred the door and stepped outside, her breath a cloud in the cold air, and she stopped dead. The prints were there, a fresh, perfect circle. It was impossible. She had been watching the entire time. Whatever had made them moved like a ghost, silent and unseen, in the last moments of darkness before the light. She walked the circle slowly, her mind racing. This was not a threat. A threat would have been direct. A broken window, a spooked horse if she had one. This was something else. It was deliberate. It was patient. And it was, in its own strange way, a kind of communication. It said, "I am here. I see you." That day, Maud made a decision. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. Curiosity, however, was a tool. She was done with being watched. She would see the watcher. That afternoon, instead of mending the fence of the small, dilapidated corral attached to the barn, she took the small sack of oats she had so carefully rationed. She poured a handful into a low, wide bucket. She filled another with fresh water from the well. She placed them together in the center of the open space before her cabin, right where the watcher would have to cross his own path to reach them. Then she went inside, leaving the door slightly ajar, and waited. The sun set, painting the vast sky in strokes of orange and violet. The coyotes began their evening chorus, their yips and howls only emphasizing her solitude. Darkness fell, thick and complete. Maud sat in her chair, the cabin unlit, her gaze fixed on the pale shape of the bucket in the moonlight. Hours passed. The moon climbed high. She must have dozed, her head nodding forward, because she was startled awake by a sound. It was a soft, chuffing breath. A horse's breath. She went utterly still. Slowly, she leaned to the side, peering through the crack in the door. A shape was materializing out of the darkness. A large, dark horse, moving with a quiet confidence that spoke of familiarity with this place. It wasn't a wild, skittish thing. It approached the buckets cautiously, its ears swiveling, its large, dark eyes seeming to scan the cabin itself. It dipped its head to the water, drinking deeply. Then it moved to the oats, nudging the bucket with its nose and lipping up the contents with a soft, whiskery sound. Maud held her breath. The horse was magnificent, even in the poor light. It was tall, well-muscled, with a coat that drank the moonlight. It was no ranch nag. This was a horse of quality. As it finished the oats, it lifted its head and looked directly at the cabin, directly at the crack in the door where she watched. For a long moment they were frozen, watcher and watched. The horse blew a soft breath through its nose, a sound of contentment, not alarm. Then, as silently as it had come, it turned and melted back into the night. The next morning, there were no prints circling the cabin. There was a single track, leading from the direction of the high mesas to the buckets, and then leading away again. The oats were gone. The water was half gone. Maud stood on her porch, a strange feeling blooming in her chest. It felt like the first crack of a smile after a long winter. She had set a table in the wilderness, and her guest had come. She refilled the buckets that day, and the next. Every night the silent visitor came. She never saw it arrive or leave, but every morning the evidence was there. She began talking to it, her voice soft in the evening quiet as she set out the offerings. "Here you are, then," she'd murmur to the empty air. "Hope you're thirsty." It felt less lonely, having a secret to keep. After a week of this ritual, she knew she had to do more. The tracks always led back toward a series of rough, broken canyons to the north, a place the maps showed as nothing but blank, impassable terrain. She packed a small bundle of bread and a canteen of water, put the empty oat bucket over her arm, and set out at dawn, following the tracks. The trail was easy to follow at first, a clear path through the sage. But as it entered the canyons, it became a puzzle. The horse was clever, using stone ridges and hard-packed ground where it could, leaving prints only when necessary. It was a trail meant to be followed only by someone who was looking for it. Several times she lost it, only to find it again by casting about, looking for a single scuffed rock or a broken twig. By midday, she was deep in a maze of red rock and juniper. The air was still and warm, sheltered from the prairie wind. She came around a towering hoodoo of sandstone, and the trail opened into a small hidden meadow she never would have found on her own. It was a pocket of impossible green, fed by a seep that trickled from the canyon wall into a clear pool. And there, standing by the pool, was the horse. In the full light of day, it was even more breathtaking. Its coat was the color of dark, wet soil after a rain, its mane and tail thick and black. It was powerful, with the deep chest and strong hindquarters of a horse bred for work and distance. It wore no saddle or bridle, but on its left flank was a brand, a strange stylized bee set inside a broken circle. It looked up as she entered the meadow, its ears pricked, but it did not bolt. It simply watched her, its dark eyes intelligent and calm. Maud stood still, her heart thumping. She had found it. She had followed the thread, and this was the source. She took a slow step forward, her hand outstretched, her voice low and soothing. "Hello there," she said softly. "You're even more handsome up close." The horse watched her approach, its nostrils flaring as it tasted her scent. It took a hesitant step toward her, then another. It recognized her, or at least her smell, the scent of the woman who brought the oats. "That's far enough." The voice was rough, like stone grating on stone. It came from the shadows of the canyon wall, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the bucket. A man stepped out from behind a curtain of old man's beard lichen. He was tall and broad, dressed in worn buckskins that blended with the rock and dust. A thick, untrimmed beard covered the lower half of his face, and his hair was long and shaggy. but it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and fierce, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. He held a rifle in the crook of his arm, and he held it like it was part of him. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "What do you want here?" Maud's heart was hammering against her ribs, but she stood her ground. She had faced down foremen and cruel mistresses. She would not be cowed by a wild man in the hills, no matter how startling. She lifted her chin. "I might ask you the same thing," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This horse has been visiting my cabin." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Your cabin?" A harsh, skeptical sound came from his throat. "There's no cabin here. Not for 50 years. I bought the old Blackwood place," she said simply. "From the land office in Redemption." The man froze. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Pain or anger, or both. He looked from her to the deed she didn't hold, then back to her face. "The Blackwood place," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "This is my horse," he said, his voice flat. He gave a low whistle, and the horse, which had been standing calmly near Maud, turned and trotted to his side, nuzzling his shoulder. The man's hand came up to stroke the thick, dark mane, a gesture of unconscious affection. "He seems to have taken a liking to my oats," Maud said, holding up the empty bucket. The man's gaze dropped to the bucket, then back to her face. He saw her worn coat, her calloused hands, the lack of fear in her eyes. He saw the bucket, a simple domestic object that had no place in this wild, hidden corner of the world. For the first time, his hostile expression wavered. "He's been circling my cabin every night," she pressed on, sensing the shift, watching. "I wanted to know why." The man was silent for a long time, his hand still on the horse's neck. He looked at her, a woman alone in the middle of nowhere, following a ghost horse into the canyons. He looked at his horse, Clay, who was nudging the empty bucket in her hand, clearly hoping for more. The animal's simple, honest appetite was a betrayal of his own guardedness. Clay, who trusted no one but him, had walked to her door and accepted her offering. Finally he spoke, his voice less harsh. "He was checking. The cabin's been empty a long time." He didn't explain what he was checking for. He didn't explain who he was. He just stood there, a man caught out of time, guarding a place that had, by some trick of paper and money, been sold out from under him. The encounter ended in a standoff, a silent truce brokered by a horse and an empty oat bucket. He didn't tell her his name. He didn't invite her to stay, and he didn't tell her to leave. When she turned and started the long walk back, he and the horse simply stood and watched her go, two silent statues against the red rock, leaving her with more questions than she had arrived with. A week later, the sky turned the color of a dull pewter, and the wind began to bite. Maud had felt the change in her bones, a deep, damp cold that promised a hard winter. She had spent the days since meeting the wild man and his horse in a state of heightened awareness. The hoofprints did not return. The silence was once again just silence. The lack of them was a lonelier thing than their presence had been. She missed her visitor. She missed the mystery. The snow began as fat, wet flakes in the late afternoon, melting as they hit the ground. But as dusk fell, the temperature plummeted. The flakes grew smaller, harder, and the wind began to howl, picking them up and driving them in blinding sheets. This was no gentle snowfall. This was a blizzard, a whiteout that erased the world beyond her windows. She stuffed rags into the cracks around the door and window frames and kept the fire roaring. The cabin, which had felt so solid, now seemed a fragile shell against the fury of the storm. She was checking the dwindling woodpile in the lean-to when she heard it. A sound of distress, a frantic scrabbling at the outside wall, followed by a low, pained nicker. It was almost lost in the shriek of the wind. Maud grabbed her lantern, her heart leaping into her throat. She pulled her thin coat tight, unbarred the door, and stepped into a wall of white. The force of the wind nearly knocked her over. The snow was a physical thing, stinging her face and blinding her. Holding the lantern high, she pushed her way around the corner of the cabin, and there he was, the dark horse, Clay. He was pressed against the dubious shelter of the log walls, his magnificent coat plastered with snow. One leg was lifted, and a dark, ugly gash ran down his cannon bone, a stark black-red line against the white of the snow. He must have slipped on an icy rock in the storm, trying to get to the cabin. To her. "Oh, you poor thing," Maud breathed, her own cold forgotten. She approached him slowly, her voice a low murmur against the wind. "It's all right. It's me. We need to get you out of this." The horse was shivering, not just from cold, but from pain and fear. He let her come close, nuzzling his wet nose into her shoulder as if for reassurance. Getting him into the small, rickety barn seemed impossible, but leaving him out here was a death sentence. She took his forelock in one gentle hand. "Come on, boy," she urged. "Just a few steps. You can do it." He followed her, limping badly, his trust in her absolute. It took all her strength to shoulder open the barn door against the drifting snow and lead him inside. The space was small, barely big enough for him to turn around, but it was out of the wind. She lit another lantern, hung it on a nail, and surveyed the damage. The gash was deep, ragged, and bleeding sluggishly. It needed to be cleaned and stitched, but she had no thread fine or strong enough. She did what she could. She tore strips from one of her two petticoats, her hands moving with a practiced competence learned from tending sick farm animals in her youth. She washed the wound with precious water, warmed over the lantern's glass. She remembered a patch of yarrow she had seen growing near the well. She had harvested and dried the leaves, just in case. Yarrow was the old way, the way of the earth, good for stopping bleeding and preventing corruption of the flesh. She crushed the dried leaves and packed them into the wound, then bound it tightly with the clean strips of cloth. The horse stood patiently through it all, his head lowered, his warm breath fogging in the cold air. When she was done, she rubbed his nose and spoke to him softly, her voice a thread of comfort in the roaring dark. "There now, that's the best I can do for you." She found an old blanket, her only spare one, and draped it over his back. He was safe. He was warm. But his master was out in the storm. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She must have been in the barn for an hour or more. When she finally fought her way back to the cabin, exhausted and frozen, she nearly screamed. The door, which she had left unbarred, was open a crack. A dark shape stood just inside, shaking snow from a heavy coat. It was him, the man from the canyon. He looked up as she stumbled in, his pale eyes wild and desperate. He was coated in snow, his beard and hair iced with it. He looked like a creature of the storm itself. "My horse," he said, his voice a raw rasp. "The tracks ended here. I saw the light in the barn." "He's safe," Maud said quickly, pushing the door shut against the wind. "He's hurt. I've done what I can." He stared at her, his chest heaving, his gaze taking in her wind-whipped hair, her clothes damp from the snow, the smear of blood on her sleeve that was not her own. He said nothing. He simply crossed the small room in 2 strides and went to the barn without another word. Maud followed. He knelt in the straw beside the horse, his big, rough hands running over the bandage with a surprising gentleness. He examined her work, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. Clay nickered softly and nudged his master's shoulder. The man closed his eyes for a moment, his whole body seeming to sag with relief. When he opened them, he looked at Maud. For the first time, the fierceness was gone. In its place was a raw, aching vulnerability that was far more disarming. "You saved him," he said. "It wasn't a thank you. It was a statement of fact. spoken with a sense of wonder. The blizzard raged for 3 days. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin and the small, connected barn. They were trapped. Two strangers and a wounded horse, suspended in a sea of white. A strange, quiet rhythm established itself. Maud cooked her meager food, and he ate it without comment. He chopped a mountain of firewood from a fallen log he dragged to the lean-to, his axe falling with a steady, powerful beat that was the only sound besides the wind. He never said thank you for the food, and she never said thank you for the wood. The gestures were the only words they needed. He spent most of his time in the barn with Clay, changing the dressing as she had shown him, murmuring to the horse in a low voice she couldn't quite hear. She would watch him from the doorway, this wild, silent man. She noticed the way his hands were gentle with the horse, the way he moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motion. He was not wild, she realized. He was wounded. The wilderness was just the place he had gone to hide. On the second night, the fever set in for the horse. Clay began to tremble, his coat damp with sweat despite the cold. The man, whose name she still did not know, grew frantic. "It's the wound," he said, his voice tight with panic. "It's going bad." Maud felt the horse's neck. He was burning up. She knew this stage. It was the turning point. "We need to get willow bark," she said. "There's a stand of it down by the creek bed I saw. It will bring the fever down." "In this?" He gestured toward the howling blackness outside. "It's impossible." "Then he will die," she said, her voice flat and hard. It was a cruelty, but it was a necessary one. He looked from her to the horse and back again. He saw no panic in her, only resolve. He gave a sharp nod. "Where?" She described the place as best she could. He pulled on his heavy coat, took the lantern, and went out into the storm without another word. Maud sat with Clay, bathing his head with cool water, speaking to him, praying to a God she hadn't bothered in years. An hour passed, then 2. She began to think he wasn't coming back, that the storm had taken him. Then the door creaked open and he stumbled in. A human snowdrift, clutching a handful of frozen willow branches. They worked together then, in the small warm circle of the lantern light. She showed him how to strip the bark and steep it in hot water to make a bitter tea. He held the horse's head while she coaxed the brew down its throat. They sat in the straw side by side, watching the horse, neither of them speaking. In the shared, silent vigil, something shifted. The space between them was no longer filled with suspicion, but with a fragile, unspoken alliance. She must have fallen asleep, her head against the rough wall of the stall, because she woke with a start to find his coat draped over her shoulders. He was sitting across from her, his back against the opposite wall, the rifle across his knees. He was watching her, not with the fierce suspicion of their first meeting, but with a quiet, searching gaze. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. He hesitated for a long moment. "Arden," he said finally. The name felt strange in the small space, a piece of a world that didn't exist here. "I'm Maud." They sat in silence again, their names hanging in the air between them. Later, as she changed the dressing on the horse's leg, her fingers brushed his as he held the bandage. The touch was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a sudden, startling warmth. He pulled his hand back as if burned. In the flickering light, she saw the brand on Clay's flank more clearly, the stylized B in the broken circle. "Blackwood," she said, not as a question. "That's what it stands for, isn't it? The brand." Arden went still. The fragile warmth between them vanished, replaced by the old, cold guard. He looked away, his jaw tight. "It's just a brand," he said, his voice flat. But Maud knew it wasn't. He was a Blackwood. And this cabin, this land, this whole forgotten valley, had once been his. She had bought a piece of his history for $80, and he had been circling it in the night like a ghost haunting his own grave. The blizzard broke on the fourth day. The world was a pristine, dazzling landscape of white under a painfully bright sun. The silence that returned was different, heavy with things unsaid. Arden's horse, Clay, was on the mend. The fever was gone, and the wound was clean. Arden himself was restless, pacing the small cabin like a caged animal. The intimacy of the storm had passed, and the realities of the world were pressing in. He was standing on the porch, staring out at the mountains when they saw the riders. Two of them, dark figures moving slowly through the deep snow. Arden's hand went instantly to the rifle that was never far from his side. "It's Hastings," he said, his voice a low growl. "The banker from town." Maud felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. "Mr. Hastings," the man with the plump, soft hands and the smirk that never reached his eyes. "What does he want here?" "He wants what he always wants," Arden said bitterly. "Everything." Hastings and his companion, a burly man with a mean-looking face, reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin. Hastings' face was a mask of sour disapproval as he took in the scene. The smoke curling from the chimney, the neatly stacked firewood, and Arden Blackwood standing on the porch of the cabin he was supposed to have abandoned years ago. "Blackwood," Hastings said, his tone dripping with false bonhomie. "Well, I'll be. The prodigal son. I heard you'd gone to dust. And you." He turned his gaze on Maud, his eyes sweeping over her with open contempt. "The woman who bought a ghost story. Looks like you found the ghost." "What do you want, Hastings?" Arden's voice was flat. "Just checking on my property," Hastings said smoothly. He nodded toward Clay, who was standing in the open barn door, his bandaged leg visible. "That's a fine-looking animal. A stray, I presume, found on my land." He dismounted, pulling a lead rope from his saddle. "I'll just take him off your hands. Finders keepers, as they say. But the land is the real finder here." Arden took a step forward, his body tensing. But then he stopped. Maud saw the old look come over his face, the shuttered, withdrawn expression of a man used to losing. He had fought this battle with Hastings before, with paper and laws he didn't understand, and he had lost everything. He was retreating back into his shell, back into the silence that had been his only defense. Seeing him falter, Maud felt a surge of anger so fierce it surprised her. She stepped in front of him, placing herself between Hastings and the barn. "This horse is not a stray," she said, her voice clear and cold. "He was injured, and he sought shelter here. He is under my care." Hastings laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your care? You're a squatter woman. And he jerked his chin at Arden, is a trespasser. This land and everything on it belongs to the bank." "I have a deed," Maud said, her chin high. "A deed to a worthless, abandoned cabin. It gives you no rights to strays. Now stand aside." He made to push past her. "The law says," Maud began, her mind racing, pulling a half-remembered line from a book she had dusted 100 times in her old employer's library, "that an animal seeking aid is under the protection of the one who gives it, until a marshal can determine ownership. It's called the law of refuge." She had no idea if that was true. She had made it up, weaving together scraps of sense and hope. But she said it with such conviction that Hastings actually paused. He stared at her, his mouth slightly open. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by a woman with nothing. His surprise quickly turned to fury. "The law?" he sneered. "I'll bring the law. You can be sure of that. The marshal will be very interested to know you're harboring a horse thief and a vagrant." He glared at Arden. "You should have stayed gone, Blackwood. This time I'll make sure you do." He remounted his horse, his face flushed with rage. "I'll be back," he spat. "And when I come, I'm bringing papers that will see you both thrown so far off this mountain, you'll never find your way back." He wheeled his horse and galloped away, his hired man close behind, leaving deep, angry furrows in the pristine snow. The silence they left behind was heavy and cold. Arden wouldn't look at her. He turned and walked back into the cabin, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "He's right," he said, his voice hollow. He stared at the wall, at a place far beyond it. "I should have stayed gone." "He was bluffing," Maud said, following him inside. "We have the horse. Possession is—" "You don't understand," he cut her off, turning to face her, his eyes full of a pain so deep it stole her breath. "He has the paper. He always has the paper. My father fought him, and it broke him. The lawyers, the courts, they don't care about what's right. They care about what's written. And Hastings does the writing." He saw the trouble he had brought to her door, the danger reflected in her determined face. And it broke him. The quiet alliance of the storm, the warmth that had begun to grow between them, was a liability he couldn't afford, and a risk he couldn't ask her to take. Protecting her meant returning to the one thing he knew: silence, absence. That night she woke to a familiar sound, the soft crunch of hooves on snow. She scrambled from her cot, her heart pounding, and ran to the door. In the pale blue moonlight she saw him. Arden was leading Clay away from the cabin, his back straight and unforgiving. He didn't look back. "Arden, wait!" she cried, her voice a raw whisper. He stopped but didn't turn. "He'll leave you alone if I'm gone," he said, his voice carrying on the cold, still air. "Sell the horse. Tell them you found him. You'll be safe." "I don't want to be safe," she pleaded, taking a step onto the porch. "I want you to stay." He finally turned then, and even from a distance, she could see the agony on his face. "You bought a cabin, Maud. Not my family's fight. You don't deserve to lose what little you have because of me." Before she could say another word, he swung up onto Clay's back and urged him into a canter. He disappeared into the darkness from which he had come, leaving her alone in the vast, silent, white world. The hoofprints, which had once been a circle of protection, were now a single, straight line leading away, and their absence was the cruelest wound of all. The silence of the cabin was a physical weight. For 2 days, Maud moved through her chores in a fog of despair. The neat stack of firewood Arden had cut was a constant reproach. The mended porch rail felt sturdy under her hand, a reminder of his quiet care. Every morning she woke with a start, her ears straining for the sound of hoofbeats that did not come. She was alone again, just as she had been when she arrived, but it was different now. Before, she had only been solitary. Now, she was lonely. Hastings would be back. She knew it. And without Arden, without the horse, she had nothing. She had stood up to him once, but she couldn't do it again. The fight had gone out of her, leaving a cold, hollow ache. On the 3rd day, she was sweeping the floor, the motions automatic, when her broom caught on a loose floorboard near the hearth. It was a board she had swept over 100 times, but today, driven by a desperate, aimless energy, she stopped. She knelt down and pried at the edge with her fingers. It came up easily. Beneath it was a small, hollow space. And in that space was a flat tin box, the kind used for tobacco or tea. It was rusted at the edges but heavy. Her heart gave a sudden painful lurch. She lifted it out. With trembling fingers, she worked open the lid. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't money. It was letters. A small, neat stack of them, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink a faint brown. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. "My dearest Emmett," the first one began. Emmett. Arden's father, perhaps. She hesitated, feeling like a thief. But the sense of despair, the feeling of Arden's defeat, pushed her on. She had to know. She untied the ribbon and began to read. They were from Arden's mother, Celia Blackwood, written in the first years of their life at the cabin. They were love letters, not to a person, but to a place, and to the promise it represented. My dearest Emmett, she read, the cabin is complete. It stands against the wind like a promise you made to me in stone and wood. You say it is just a line shack, but I know it is the heart of this valley, the place our children's children will call home. You have built me a sanctuary, and I will never leave it. Maud's hands trembled as she read on. The letters spoke of the joy of this wild place, of the naming of the creeks and the mesas. They spoke of a dream, of a family holding this land not as a possession, but as a trust. And then, in the last letter, she found it. Hastings' father was here again today, Celia had written, her elegant script suddenly sharp and angry. He spoke of survey lines and banknotes, his words like poison in our clean air. He does not understand this place. He sees only acres to be sold. But you, my love, you are clever. Your surveyor's gift, as you called it, is our secret anchor. Let him redraw his lines on paper. The truth is carved in the stone at the base of the Sentinel Rock, where only a Blackwood would know to look. Our claim is etched into the land itself. The truth is carved in the stone. Maud read the line again and again. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't a legal document. It was better. It was a story. It was a promise. It was the why. This wasn't just about land. It was about love, and a legacy Hastings had tried to bury. In that moment, something inside Maud shifted. The despair was burned away by a clean, hot anger. Arden hadn't lost a fight over property. He had lost his family's story. And she was holding it in her hands. She didn't hesitate. She packed the letters carefully in the tin box and put it in her valise. She put on her coat, took the last of her money, and walked out the door. She did not bar it. She did not look back. She started the long walk to redemption, not to flee, but to fight. Meanwhile, Arden had not gone far. He had made it to the edge of the valley, the pass that led back to the world of men, and he had stopped. He could not do it. He could not leave her. He had spent 2 days on a high ridge, a ghost watching a ghost, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He watched her tiny figure moving about the cabin, a beacon of warmth and life in his desolate world. He saw her leave, her back straight, walking east toward the town. He thought she was fleeing, and he couldn't blame her. Then he saw the other riders. Hastings. And this time he had 2 men with him. They weren't riding toward the pass. They were riding toward the empty cabin. They meant to burn her out, to erase her from this place just as they had tried to erase him. Clay sensed his master's agitation, stamping and blowing. Arden's hand was on the reins, his mind a turmoil of indecision. To go down there was to walk back into the trap. To stay here was to let Hastings win, to let him desecrate the last pure thing in his life. As he hesitated, Clay took the decision from him. The horse, who had been brought back from the brink by Maud's hands, broke the rotten branch Arden had tied him to and bolted, not toward the pass, but back down, toward the cabin, toward her. It was the animal's final, decisive act. It chose for him. With a curse and a prayer, Arden spurred his own weary horse after him, racing toward a confrontation he had spent his life avoiding. Maud arrived in redemption covered in dust, her hair wild, her eyes burning with purpose. She walked straight into the saloon, the one place every man of influence would be. The room fell silent. There stood Hastings, holding a drink, laughing with the land agent. "Well, well," Hastings said, his face darkening. "Look what the wind blew in. Come to beg, have you?" "I've come to finish a conversation," Maud said, her voice ringing in the sudden quiet. She walked to his table and placed the tin box on it. "I believe you know the Blackwood family." At that moment, the saloon doors swung open again. It was Arden. He was dusty and grim, but he was there. His eyes found Maud, and a look of profound relief and terror crossed his face. He saw Hastings, and his hand dropped to the worn pistol at his belt. Get away from her, Hastings, he said, his voice low and deadly. Hastings laughed. The whole family reunion. How touching. He made a move toward Maud. You have no place here, woman. He grabbed her arm. It was the final push Arden needed. The years of passivity fell away. He lunged forward, not with the wildness of a cornered animal, but with the focused strength of a man defending his home. He shoved Hastings back, putting himself between the banker and Maud. Don't you touch her. It was the first rescue. The second was hers. He doesn't have to, Maud said, her voice steady. She opened the tin box. She did not take out a deed. She took out a letter. I have something for you all to hear. A story about this valley. And she began to read. She read of Celia's love for the land. She read of the promise between a husband and a wife. She read of a family's heart, built of logs and stone. Her voice didn't waver. She wasn't speaking to the law or to the bank. She was speaking to the men in the room, men whose own grandparents had come to this land with nothing but a dream. She was pulling Arden's story out of the dust and giving it back to him, right here, in front of everyone. When she got to the part about the surveyor's gift, a hush fell over the room. The truth is carved in stone, she read, her eyes finding Arden's, at the base of the Sentinel Rock, where only a Blackwood would know to look. The town marshal, who had been watching from the back, stepped forward. The Sentinel Rock? He said, looking at Arden. I know that place. My own grandfather used to talk about the old survey markers. Hastings was sputtering, his face pale. It's nonsense. The ramblings of a dead woman. My papers are legal. But no one was listening to him. They were looking at Arden. They were looking at the man who had been a ghost and seeing the son of a founder. Maud had not saved his land. She had saved his name. She had pulled him from the grave of his own grief. The mockery of the town had turned to a stunned, respectful silence. The truth she had uncovered was more powerful than any deed. It was a truth carved in stone, and now, spoken aloud in a saloon, it had finally come home. The autumn that followed was gentle, a long golden breath before the winter. The cabin porch was warm in the afternoon sun. The porch rail, mended by Arden's hands, was solid under Maud's. Below, in the hidden meadow that was no longer a secret, Clay grazed peacefully beside a new mare. The valley was coming back to life. After Maud read the letter in the saloon, everything changed. The marshal, a fair man hampered by a lack of evidence, now had a place to look. He and Arden and 2 other men from the town rode out to the Sentinel Rock. And there, cleared of a century's worth of dirt and lichen, was the original surveyor's mark, a deep, chiseled cross with the Blackwood B beside it. It proved that Hastings's deed was based on a fraudulent survey that had cut the heart out of the Blackwood claim. The banker left town in the night, leaving his paper empire to collapse behind him. The town, which had first pitied and then mocked Maud, now treated her with a deep, quiet respect. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress who had watched her with such suspicion, now saved the best apples from her tree for her. The men who had laughed at the land office now tipped their hats and called her Mrs. Blackwood, though she wasn't. Not yet. Arden was a changed man. The silence and sorrow were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. He had stepped back into his own story. He worked from sunup to sundown, restoring the main ranch house down in the valley, but every evening he rode up the trail to the small cabin on the mesa. It was the heart of the valley, he'd said. It was their sanctuary. He sat beside her now on the porch steps, his shoulder warm against hers. He had been quiet for a long time, watching the sun dip below the canyon walls, painting the sky in the same colors she had seen in his mother's letters. I never thought I'd see this place come alive again, he said, his voice low. After my parents were gone, it was just a place of ghosts. I was just another one of them, I guess. The Hoofprints, she said softly. You were watching the cabin, even before I came." He nodded, not looking at her. "It was a promise I made to my father, that I'd watch over the place. I'd ride the circle every night, make sure no squatter tried to burn it down, make sure the land remembered a Blackwood was still here. It was all I had left to do." He finally turned to her, his pale eyes clear and full of a light she had put there. "Then you came. I saw your light in the window that first night, and I didn't know if you were the biggest threat of all, or the answer to a prayer I'd forgotten how to say." "And what do you think now?" she asked, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs. He didn't answer with words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a simple gold ring. It was worn with age, but it glowed in the fading light. "My mother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She wrote in one of her letters, the one you didn't read in the saloon. She said she hoped this ring would one day be on the hand of a woman who loved this valley as much as she did. A woman who understood it wasn't about the land, but about the home you build on it." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "You did that, Maud. You came here with nothing, and you built a home. You brought me home." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She looked from the ring to his face, her vision blurring with tears she didn't bother to hide. She had come here seeking only a roof over her head, a place to be left alone. She had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for: a history to honor, a future to build, and a man who had been circling his own lonely heart, waiting for someone to finally come and knock on the door. The last ray of sunlight touched the top of the Sentinel Rock, and down in the valley, a single lamp was lit in the window of the old ranch house. But up here, in the cabin that had started it all, they didn't need a lamp. They had all the light they needed. And as a new, deeper quiet settled over the valley, Maud knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that she would never be lonely again. What we find in the quietest places can often make the loudest change in our hearts. We hope this story of a love that was written in the land itself found a home in yours. If it did, we'd be so grateful if you'd like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. We have a question for you, and we love reading your answers in the comments. Would you have followed the tracks into the canyon? From all of us here, thank you for listening, and may you always find your way home.